We'll give you a little time to settle yet. With the internet going down, we're not quite sure where we're at with recording. I'm going to try to do this with my phone. So just as a backup, if other things don't work. This is something we talk about in our discussion class, or I don't know, what do we call it by now? I'm looking around for other class members. We often have discussions about what's going on currently in our country and politically. And it may seem like talking about the Supreme Court is kind of totally separate kind of realm from what we talk about as a church and the concerns we have there. I did a little brief search on kind of the connection in the Bible and what it says about judges and about kings and such. And Proverbs 29 seemed especially appropriate here. This is not all of the verses, but many of the verses out of Proverbs 29. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. By justice, a king gives stability to the land, but one who makes heavy expectations ruins it. The righteous know the rights of the poor. The wicked have no such understanding. If the wise go to law with fools, there is ranting and ridicule without relief. If a ruler listens to falsehoods, all his officials will be wicked. If a king judges the poor with equity, his throne will be established forever. I think we can make a lot of connections between our faith and what we exercise here and what's going on in our country today. Just one more thing from Deuteronomy 1. And this is Moses talking to the people of Israel, and they're setting up this new way of being, anticipating setting up this new way of being. I charge your judges at this time. Give the members of your community a fair hearing and judge rightly between persons, one and another, get this, whether kin or resident alien. Meaning that the same laws that apply to the country in general ought to also be applied to people who are not resident in that nation. You must not be partial in judging. Hear out the small and the great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for judgment is God's. So I think hopefully that at least sets a little framework for today to say we are interested in how justice is conducted. I know a lot of people have just simple questions about how is this working or how is this not working. So Bill, we're just going to turn this over to you and see what you have for us.
Thanks, Roger. Oh, well. Hopefully everybody can hear without difficulty. I made just a few notes, which you obviously don't need, but they will be somewhat helpful to me. And I didn't make nearly enough of them. And if Roger asked me if I could do this a couple of weeks ago, I wish I would have just been able to do it right then, because then I wouldn't have thought about it for 2 weeks. And thinking about it for 2 weeks means that I have enough to think about in terms of questions I could ask and discussions we could have that would take most of a semester. But Brian reminds me, Sunday school ends at 11:30, and other people have other things that they need to do, and we're going to try to make this quick. I hope that much of it will be questions that all of you have, and that we can simply talk. I will not have answers, though. And that's really the fundamental thing to start with. And Donna, if I don't have answers, I was hoping that Doug would be able to stay, because Doug was one of my former students, and he's still one of the people in charge. I've retired 5 years ago. Donna, I know you've retired too, but you can turn your head around and ask for her help. I may be doing that from time to time. Bottom line is, there are no easy answers. I remember at one point, Gabe today during the sermon made a comment about knowing that things are likely to go badly. That was part of the sermon this morning. I think it has very broad applications to what we're going to be talking about. I know things are going to go badly, and there are a lot of reasons for that. The fact that we have a constitution that spells a lot of things out doesn't mean that we have necessarily good answers, certainly doesn't mean we have easy answers, and the best that I'm going to be able to do is explain at least some of the reasons why. And again, my hope is that it will be your questions and your discussion that lead much of this. On the notes that I put together, I started by identifying a couple of the sort of easy constitutional questions that are involved, where there is fairly explicit text. For example, the whole idea of birthright citizenship. Some of you have heard that what President Trump would like to do is just declare that if people didn't come to the United States legally and they have children, those children would not be citizens, even though they were born in the United States. Well, the fact is that the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which is at the bottom of those notes, nevertheless spells out very specifically that again, no person shall, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said 22nd Amendment, it's 14th Amendment that says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Trump would like to make something out of the or subject to the jurisdiction of thereof. That was meant only to apply to children of diplomats. So if you're the ambassador from France and you have a child while you're living here in the United States, that child is still a French citizen, not an American citizen. Diplomats are in a different category. That issue was addressed more than 100 years ago. It had to do, the first time it was addressed with, and one has to say, we've got a lot of experiences in our history that are not good. One approach to that is to simply ignore it all and rule it out of the books and so forth that our children will study in the future, and therefore we won't ever have to worry about the fact that we have such a horrible history. But we do have a history filled with racism, among other things. And for example, people who came from China to work in the United States at one time, building railroads and so forth, were not considered to be eligible for citizenship. Never, scratch that, were not themselves coming as potential citizens, but their children who were born here did become citizens. And the Supreme Court tied that down. There should be no question either about the text or about its application. Nevertheless, what the Trump administration would like to do is to change all of that and radically change our history. We know that if you come to the United States and you're not the child of a diplomat, you're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And therefore, if you're born here under those circumstances, you are a citizen of the United States. It's true not only in the United States, but several other countries have very similar provisions. The language is clear. Nevertheless, the effort is there to change the meaning. And that raises what is one of the underlying key questions: how are we ever going to determine what the meaning of text like that is? Who gets to make that decision? Well, obviously it's the courts. At least one would think that that would be obvious. And as these issues make their way to the Supreme Court, then you have questions about how does a court make decisions about text when there might be some alternative ways of thinking about that text. I could go on for a long time about that particular issue. In fact, I've taught an entire course where we did nothing but talk about that issue. Bottom line is, different people have different views. Do you look at the text as the words were understood at the time when the text itself came into law, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? That's one of the approaches. And that has tended to be the approach adopted by a relatively conservative component of the judicial branch. Justice Scalia was fond of having dictionaries in his office, multiple dictionaries from all periods of our history so that he could choose the right dictionary for the right time. And by the way, also the right dictionary because it gave him the answer that he particularly wanted in a particular case. So he would have multiple dictionaries at any given period of time. Justice Stephen Breyer, who was seen as one of the leaders of the more liberal branch of the court, said we should think about how those words are understood today. We should think about the issues and the problems that we're facing today. We should think about how the people who drafted that language 200 years ago would want it to be interpreted today, given the circumstances that we deal with today. And those debates are ongoing debates with no easy answers. You know, you can make strong arguments on the way. And that's one of the key underlying constitutional issues that you end up having to deal with. How do you interpret it? And given that the court will make the interpretation, then who's on the court and what methods will they use in that interpretation? And let me pause for a moment if there are questions just about that whole underlying issue of interpretation and how we can figure out what the answers are going to be. And there's another one, an even easier one, in terms of text, and that has to do with term limits of a president. You know, can President Trump run for a third term of office? This is Amendment 22, which is at the bottom of the page of notes that I gave you. No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once. That language is pretty darn clear. It was adopted pretty recently. Is there any way that Trump can get around it? He's talked about, well, maybe I could make Vance the president and then he would resign and turn things over to me because I would be the vice president. There's language in the 12th Amendment saying that in order to be vice president, you have to be eligible to be president. So the text rules out that option. Can you think of any way in which, nevertheless, President Trump could serve a third term? What if Congress simply failed to certify any new person as president? It's scary, it's frightening. It's the best I can come up with. I really do think that this surely is just a dance that's being played in order to divert attention. I don't think that this is one I would spend any time worrying about. Nevertheless, that's the best that I could come up with in terms of options which might be there. There are all kinds of questions about the authority that the president has to make law. And, you know, how is it that suddenly the President of the United States is overturning all kinds of things that Congress had enacted? After all, one of the provisions of the Constitution is that Congress shall make the law, and then it's up to the president to execute that law. But think about the many ways in which you can get around that kind of language. For example, most obvious, what about the times when Congress makes the law, they open up the door for presidential discretion. For the president to decide, okay, what's really important now, what's in the best interest of the country, and so on and so forth, and to what extent are they able to use issues of that sort to modify what they do. Yeah, Rich.
Like, the First Amendment and throwing people out of the country because you don't like what they're hearing. Yeah, I mean, it just, that's one where if I read this correctly, the First Amendment, it's difficult for me to see how, even if you are here on a visa, you can just be, corralled up and thrown out of the country or put in a detention center. That just, why is it that the court has, why is it that the Secretary of State has this independent discretion to nullify the First Amendment? How did that happen?
That is, to me, one of the more perplexing questions, and also does such a wonderful job of highlighting why there isn't an easy answer to it. Because you'd think, geez, how can you get around this? It seems like the easiest answer in the world. But there are a number of ways to avoid that particular problem. If what the Secretary of State does is simply, or whoever is responsible for such things, simply rounds a person up, moves them to El Salvador, and puts them in prison in El Salvador under the jurisdiction of El Salvador. And sounds horrendous, particularly when it's done in a manner that is really based on expressions, First Amendment activities of the people who are rounded up. I don't like the tattoo on your arm. And because I don't like that tattoo, I'm going to send you to El Salvador, knowing nothing more about the person who's being sent. Well, what stage does that person who's in El Salvador now object? And how do they do it? And that becomes an example of the kind of problems. Is there any due process involved? And by due process, I mean, was that person given the opportunity to go to court and try to stop the government? No, they were rounded up and shoved into an airplane. And the opportunity to go, the opportunity to use the court to challenge what is being done was not being provided to those individuals. And if you can get around the possibility of going to court, then you don't need to worry about it. One of the things that has been used quite a lot is the Alien Enemies Act, drafted back before the Constitution itself, if I remember correctly, back in the 1780s or something of that sort, 1789, doesn't have any provision for due process. Simply gives authority to the executive to round up aliens and get rid of them without going to court. And so that's part of what the Trump administration has been trying to use. Now, it hasn't been used since World War II. It's to be used in time of war. Well, are we in war with Venezuela? President Trump says, there's an incursion into our country of people from Venezuela, and therefore we're at war with them. We can disagree forever about whether he's right about that, but you have to have the opportunity to go to court to stop him. And then there becomes a question, okay, which court? And when you're dealing with the issues of immigration, for example, an immigrant who is being kicked out of the United States doesn't necessarily have the ability or the authority to go to a federal United States district court. because our court system is much more complex than all of that. And in the deportation process, the first step is not with the federal district courts. The first step is going to be with an administrative judge in an administrative court. What's the difference between the two? Well, who appoints administrative judges? It's not authorized, it's not something, I mean, Congress has set the system up, but they've set it up in a way that you have a whole segment of judges who are administrative law judges and appointed by the president. So many of you will have read about the person down in, a person who is being deported because he was a Palestinian, spoke out at Columbia University, now being held in Louisiana. In Louisiana, the first step in the process of gaining his freedom was to go to an administrative law court. The administrative law court in Louisiana, which has ruled against him, is a judge who would be fired like that by the Trump administration if she had ruled against the administration, and who in the process said, well, the First Amendment isn't something that I have to consider. I'm here just as an administrative law judge, and I just looked at the Enemy Aliens Act, and I think the president has discretion, and therefore, let's get rid of this person. Now, there's a separate litigation over that issue going on in New Jersey, where it is filed in the federal court, and even the decision made by the person in Louisiana is subject by review, first by another administrative court, subject to the president's control, but then on appeal from that to a federal court with judges who are not subject to control. But even there, who appointed those judges and what will their personal preferences be? To what extent will there be discretion in terms of how they interpret the underlying rules involved? You would think that at that stage the First Amendment would come into play, and that you couldn't simply deport somebody because they spoke out against what Israel was doing in Gaza. But we can't be sure of that. And particularly given the degree of discretion that the administration is given in determining who should and should not be deported. Once again, you get back to that question of, okay, what's the text of the statutes that provide for deportation of somebody? And how much discretion appears within those statutes that give to the president authority to act? And is there any way of claiming, well, it's not really a First Amendment activity I'm acting on, it's rather an alliance with a foreign enemy that we should eliminate from inside of the United States because they might cause disruption, they might cause civil war, and so on and so forth. Oh boy, those are tough issues to try to predict, particularly when we're not quite sure who are going to make the decisions that we're dealing with.
How does the judiciary enforce their rulings?
That's an absolutely wonderful question, because the basic answer is they issue orders which in turn are followed by the executive branch. And if you consider that to be a complete answer, then I'm, okay, that's the problem. That issue really first arose back, it's not clear under the text of the Constitution. It first arose in a case called Marbury versus Madison, decided back in 1805. Is that, Donna, you can correct me on things like this. But it involved a very high-level dispute over who had authority to appoint a particular person as a judge and so on and so forth. And it was resolved in a manner by which the Supreme Court gave itself the authority to make final decisions which could not be altered by the executive branch, and which the executive branch had to follow it. And they made it in a decision where there was nothing that the executive branch could do. So that there was no dispute in that particular case. For the subsequent 220 years, the executive branch has always complied. And that's the best I can give as an answer.
So if the executive branch does not comply, what happens?
Another terrific question. First stage, you could in turn, in various ways, hold whoever it is that's not complying in contempt. That is, punish them in some way. Now, if it's the president, the current Supreme Court has declared that the president is really immune from anything. Certainly cannot be criminally punished in any way, cannot be fined in any way, cannot have any personal repercussions that affect that person so long as he's acting in a manner that is within the scope of the office of the president. The broad immunity ruling that was handed down by the court a couple of years ago, having to do with activities that Trump was at the time being criminally prosecuted over, was the broadest definition of immunity that anybody had previously even considered. Certainly none of the lower courts had considered immunity to be as broad as our US Supreme Court said it should be. And so the president himself is basically there, and there's nothing that can be done other than impeachment. Yeah, Judy.
Well, what about the states who are suing him for things? Is that different?
Yes.
They can go ahead and do that.
Well, yes and no. The states can certainly pursue claims. Whether the Supreme Court would at any point have authority to step in is, again, a totally separate question that has never been addressed or resolved. But there are certainly ways, particularly when the person is no longer president, no longer in the office. I mean, as long as the person is president, the states are restricted from being able to pursue any of their claims, basically. Once the person is no longer president, then the question becomes one involving the scope of the state authority. And there are a lot of issues there that are unresolved, but there are possible ways in which individuals, in which action could take place within individual states at that stage.
What's in 1807, they passed the Insurrection Act in Congress. Is that what you were talking about?
No.
Okay. Trump wanted to put that in effect after the Floyd thing, when they had all the demonstrations, billions of people demonstrating about that.
Yeah.
The military held him off, but now he has purged a lot of the people in the military that had good judgment. So if he get, I think it's April the 20th, they have to make a report on that. But he can exercise the Insurrection Act. That doesn't seem to be, then he has total control.
And it's not an issue that, it was not part of what I had thought about in this context, but it could be an illustration of ways in which he can get around being kicked out of office 4 years from now. The kind of total control that he, with the backup of the military, could provide, so as to prevent somebody else from taking office. You want to think at least that is so extreme that it's not going to happen. But where those lines are drawn and what authority would be there, then we've got to say there is the possibility that things will happen that it will be outside of the control of the courts, in essence, that the military will be taking over. And the whole question as to the extent to which the U.S. military follows the orders of the president when it appears that those orders themselves violate the Constitution, violates human rights. That's another one of those where we don't have answers. The primary reason we don't have answers is because we didn't have presidents who were violating people's human rights in that sense. And so we don't, it hasn't, the limits haven't been tested. The assumption was that the leaders of the military would in fact protect our human rights even from potential government orders that they view to be in violation of a constitution. But we've all seen articles and so forth basically suggesting that Trump got rid of the military who would stand up in that sense. Got rid of the military leaders who would take those positions.
Well, it's hard to anticipate what's going to happen, but this all reminds me of what happened in Cambodia and other countries where the potential dictator, killed off all of the educated people. And he's doing it, that's essentially the same thing by getting rid of them.
Oh, I mean,
is anybody thinking about that?
I can assure you that,
Doing something about
and you don't have to kill him. We have a son-in-law who has a PhD in atmospheric science. Funding for the research he does comes from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric, or whatever, NOAA. Yesterday, we could all read in the newspaper that the Trump administration has decided we don't need to do any scientific research on climate or the atmosphere, and all grants related to those issues are hereby canceled. Do the people therefore just become unemployed? I mean, that's the easiest answer at one level. And just firing all those people from their jobs is the equivalent to the kind of thing that, I mean, it's not the same as killing them, thank God, but nevertheless is a big part of what's going on. Yeah.
So what would be the smartest and most efficient way for Christians to respond in this kind of environment? Is it still going through the courts? Is it, taking to the streets? Is it calling our congresspeople? Do you have a sense of, because I imagine going to the streets can just say, oh, look, on April 20th, oh, look, this is destabilized you. We have to do this. What is the wisest and most efficient way to respond? I mean, I don't know if you know, but you do know some things, but I don't know.
Kathy and I were at the demonstrations on the grounds of the state capitol 8 days ago. I was amazed by the number of people who were there and thought that was a terrific kind of response. But then, letting people like Derek Schmidt know that if he continues to support the president and everything that he does, he's going to lose. But that's not an easy or quick answer by any means. And let me know if you come up with one. Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to get on that subject. I was going to ask, what does the Constitution, how do they define in the Constitution an illegal immigrant, or whatever you want to call them, illegal alien? How do they define that?
They don't. There's nothing in the text of the Constitution that identifies what those borders are. And if you study the history of 1787 and so forth, what was going on at that time, it's probably a good thing. Because back then, I mean, the 14th Amendment, when it was enacted saying, giving rise to birthright citizenship, was done in significant part to override the prior history of slavery, among other things. And there's a large part of our early history, for example, when Native Americans were being treated totally separately from citizens of the United States and so on and so forth. Very complex history, but nothing beyond birthright citizenship in the text of the Constitution as such that would give you an answer. And as I say, given what the culture was in 1787, that's probably good, because it wasn't good back then. Okay.
So I started thinking politics in 2000. I was in high school. I was the first, but I didn't get over that election. In my lifetime, and so in my lifetime that I've been paying attention, I've seen pendulum swings. And I imagine I'll continue seeing that for the rest of my life. That's not optimistic or pessimistic, it's just what I see. My question is, in 2020, there was a big concern from Republicans that if the Democrats were the president, the House, and the Senate, that they would stack the Supreme Court. But that didn't happen. But that, for me, that leaves the question, what are things that this administration or the next one can do that cannot be undone? Because what I've seen in my lifetime is one president gets elected and does all these things, and the next president gets elected and undoes everything. So we're kind of just stuck in this, never go anywhere. So what can be done that cannot be undone? Like immunity, Supreme Court?
I mean, the example of stacking the courts is a really good one. And that's what has taken place to a large extent. Now with 6 Republican-appointed justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, and I will certainly expect that a couple of them, the older ones, will retire before Trump is through, and that we will have young people on the U.S. Supreme Court that will unfortunately have the majority for the remainder of my life, at least. Again, that's the best example, and we've got to wrap up. But
yeah, could the current administration say that we can no longer do more than 9 justices? Like they get to stack it and say we're capped at 9 forever?
It would be possible to cap it, but it is not constitutionally capped as such. And this is why Franklin Roosevelt threatened to expand the court when the court was ruling against him back in the 1930s. And then the court modified what they were doing in order to prevent the court stacking. The switch in time that saved 9 is what we talk about it in a con law course. I really do, unfortunately, have to wrap things up. You'd be amazed at how many more things that we could talk about. And this is really...
We kind of got 5 minutes, started 5 minutes late, so. Yeah. 5 minutes.
I will be happy to go on for another couple of minutes, but with your questions and so forth, Sarah?
Well, I just more have a comment as I was thinking about in response to what Vicki asked. Whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's showing up to the Capitol, whether it is calling your representatives, whatever, do it consistently. Because I have seen so many people. You show up to one Topeka jump event, you show up to one protest at the Capitol, And then folks are like, well, I showed up, I told them I was angry, and it didn't work. And I think that sometimes the way our history is taught would make us think that all we have to do is just say, we're angry, or this is not right, once. That's not how history actually works. It takes so much consistency. So, like, yeah, Montgomery bus boycott, that was 18 months. There's so many more examples, and so just in whatever it is, whatever way you choose to take action, keep taking that action over and over and over and over again, and do not let yourself fall into despair if it doesn't work, after a month or two. These things do take time, but they're not going to change unless we're consistent.
And Sarah, I think that's not only a perfect response, but JUMP itself is a perfect response. We need to remember that what happens in the local community in many respects matters more than what President Trump says on any given day, and that there are things that we can do.
I just want to make sure this side got a chance to ask you a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can you speak to the SAVE Act? The SAVE Act, can you speak to specifically about the voters, about having to have the names that match the birth certificate in order to vote? Can you speak to that at all? I think it's a huge thing. And I know that Kansas now is jumping on that.
And my response to all of this voter ID stuff and so forth has been, you care terribly about being sure that you're a citizen and therefore entitled to vote, but seem not to care at all about people who are being excluded who are citizens, and that is distorting the vote every bit as much. And somehow, again, the politics have been twisted in a way that makes the one a problem and makes the other something, so that we can just throw out 2,000 ballots next time around in Kansas because the post office was slow in delivering the ballots. And I can't say anything more about that in terms of saying that there's a good answer to it.
Well, constitutionally, like the Kansas deal for now, is it constitutionally, there's no reason to say, this is also, because you already have to be a citizen to vote.
And
They're trying to make it look like there are non-citizen voters.
And that's true in terms of national offices. What's interesting in part is how very much discretion is given to the states to manage the actual elections. And it really constitutionally is given to the states. And states can make different decisions in terms of who can and cannot vote with respect to the state offices and so forth. So, and again, it's one where knowing our history makes it, should make us happy with the fact that it was not all constitutionally decided 200 years ago. For example, women were totally excluded. Rich?
Are local communities required constitutionally to exclude non-citizens from voting in local issues?
Depends on the state. That's essentially all I can say. In some states, they are allowed, and in other states, they're excluded. Whether a local community could decide to allow non-citizens to vote. And with respect to local issues and local offices, theoretically they could. But not with respect to federal positions. That's a different issue.
Real quick, is there a place to go where we can find out truth from fiction?
Let me know.
There are some men that people that talk to both sides try to do that. It's hard to find.
Is there an easy place to go? And Randy, what were you saying?
Well, I just said, my daughter has told me about a place to go, and I can't think of it right now.
Okay, next week.
Basically, you have to go to a lot of different places.
That would be my recommendation.
Of what, when I audit classes and you go through old history, you say, don't just take one person's word for it. Get many people from different positions to comment on that same thing and research that, and it's true
Well,
today.
And what scares me the most looking forward, frankly, is social media and the way in which it can be manipulated.
Just a question, as an individual in the church, how do we pray? And what do we pray for?
Got to look up someplace other than I. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
The word is to pray.
there's a place you can go and that's it.
to pray for our leaders, and I think some of these scriptures would give us direction about what to pray for in terms of not being partial to the poor, respecting the rights of aliens, people who are living among us, that they're to be treated well, just like everybody else in the country is. There's some places to start.
Our hope is in the Savior of the world, whose power surpasses that of any politician.
Let's give a round of applause to